Frank Harris, a 67-year-old retired Marine Master Sergeant, had served 2 decades in silence. No medals on display, no speeches made. Just scars, stories he never told, and a folded letter from his son that said, "Dad, I want you in the front row." But when Frank showed up at his only son's college graduation, wearing the same Marine dress jacket he had worn to 3 funerals and 2 wars, he was stopped at the door. No wristband, no seat, no exception. They told him to stand in the back, told him he didn't belong, until 6 Navy SEALs men who once owed him their lives stood up in the crowd, held up their Trident badges, and stopped the entire ceremony cold. What happens next will redefine what honor really means and who gets to decide who belongs. Because sometimes the man standing alone at the back of the room is the reason the flag is still flying at the front. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments. We want to know who's standing with Frank Harris. Under the bright morning sun, the front entrance of Marshall University's main auditorium buzzed with noise. Families arrived in clusters carrying signs, flowers, and excitement. Graduates in robes clicked down the concrete steps, cameras flashed, and names were already being called over loudspeakers inside. No one paid attention to the tall man standing alone near the roped-off entrance until he stepped forward. Frank Harris wore an old Marine Corps dress jacket, its edges frayed, the medals long removed. Beneath it, a simple collared shirt and jeans, both clean but faded from use. His boots were scuffed. He carried nothing but a folded piece of paper tucked into the inside pocket of his coat, and a quiet resolve that had carried him through deserts, war zones, and funerals. He walked with purpose, eyes scanning the neatly arranged rows beyond the ropes where the reserved seating was labeled "Family Guests of Honor." He took a step past the velvet line. "Sir," a young woman with a headset and clipboard appeared beside him. She didn't smile. "This section is for invited guests only. I'm on the list," Frank said plainly. "I'm Jason Harris's father." The woman didn't look at the clipboard. She looked at his jacket, then his boots, then his face worn from decades of weather and war. "Do you have a wristband or a pass?" Frank shook his head once. "He mailed me a letter. Said I'd be seated up front." "I'm going to need you to step back, sir," she said, voice tightening. Frank glanced past her toward the seats. They were filling quickly. "My son wanted me here. I'm sorry she cut in. No ID, no pass, no seat." Frank didn't move. "Not right away." The woman sighed and turned, slightly pressing her finger to the button on her radio. "Dispatch," she whispered. "We've got an older male out here near the VIP entrance. No wristband, not in the system. Can someone come verify another staff member approached from inside?" She glanced at Frank, looked back at her colleague, and raised an eyebrow. "Problem, he says he's family. Doesn't have any credentials." Frank stood still, hands behind his back, eyes forward. "My name's Frank Harris. My son is graduating today." The second woman gave a forced smile. "Sir, we can have security help you find the general seating." "I'm supposed to be in the front," Frank replied. That's what he said. At that, a uniformed campus security officer began walking towards the entrance. The crowd continued flowing around them, oblivious. Families were hugging, laughing. Phones recorded speeches from inside. Balloons floated above photo backdrops. And Frank Harris, a man who had once directed a convoy through an ambush in Kandahar, without flinching stood quietly in the eye of a storm that no one else noticed. The officer stopped beside the ushers. "Everything all right? He doesn't have a pass," the first woman said. "And he's insisting on VIP seating." Frank nodded once at the officer. "My son invited me, that's all." The officer looked Frank over, then turned to the usher. "Did you check the list we did? He's not on the printed version." The officer radioed someone. Frank stayed quiet. A few people walking past glanced his way. Most didn't. Just another old man with a mismatched jacket and no ticket. To them, he was nothing more than a misplaced name in the wrong section. "Let's step over here, sir," the officer said. Frank followed without a word, his movements deliberate. He wasn't angry. He'd been through worse. But something about the situation was beginning to feel familiar. Not in a good way. Behind the headset of the usher, the woman muttered again into her mic. "Still have no confirmation on this guy. No tag, no match, not dressed appropriately. Possibly disruptive. Keep eyes on." It wasn't said to Frank, but it was meant for him. And it echoed louder than it should have. A couple in formal wear passed by. The woman leaned in toward her husband. "Security's watching someone," she whispered. Frank didn't hear it. Or maybe he did, and just chose not to react. Instead, he adjusted the collar of his jacket eyes, scanning the rows inside once again, looking for a glimpse of his son. A small part of him thought briefly about turning around, getting back in his truck and driving 3 states back home. But he didn't. He'd driven all night, slept with one hand on the letter and the other on the wheel. Jason's handwriting was still creased into his mind. Front row, beside me. That was the promise. And he had kept his end of the deal. The security guard was now typing something into a tablet. The ushers were ignoring him. Around them, the excitement kept rising, families cheering, rows filling the speaker on stage, announcing honors and achievements. Frank stood like a statue beside a trash can and a water cooler, unnoticed by the celebration he had been asked to attend. No one knew who he was. No one asked. But deep inside the auditorium, beyond the polished rows and rows of celebration, there were eyes watching. Eyes that remembered him. Eyes that once followed his commands through smoke and fire. Eyes that had waited years for a moment like this. And they were tracking his every move. Frank stood motionless by the fire exit, the polished floor beneath him, reflecting the shifting colors of stage lights far ahead. His hands remained folded behind his back, his posture steady and firm. No one had told him where to go after security moved him aside. They didn't need to. They simply expected him to disappear into the background, like a misplaced object in a room too tidy to tolerate its presence. And so he stood there, unassigned, unwanted, and silently dismissed. The ceremony had already begun. A polished voice echoed through the sound system, listing honorary titles, achievements, and donors. Applause came in polite bursts, rising and falling in waves. No one clapped for Frank. No one even looked at him anymore, except to glance and quickly turn away as if his presence was too awkward to acknowledge directly. A security officer lingered nearby, arms folded, eyes occasionally checking on Frank but saying nothing. It wasn't hostility. It was surveillance, the kind you'd use for someone you weren't sure you could trust. Frank didn't give them a reason to act. He stood with the kind of stillness that doesn't demand attention but dares you to question it. A family seated near the exit began murmuring. The mother leaned over to a man in a pressed blue blazer. "Do you think someone should say something?" she whispered. "He's just standing there." "I already did," the man replied. "I asked if we could move forward a row. I don't feel great having my daughter next to that." His tone was low, but not low enough. Frank heard it. He didn't flinch. He had stood like this before, in the dirt, in wind, in desert heat, in ceremony lines, while taps played in the background. He had stood beside caskets wrapped in flags, beside men who couldn't stand anymore. What shook others he had long ago made peace with. But even that kind of composure had its limits. A child from a nearby seat peeked toward him. Their mother gently redirected their attention to the stage. "Eyes forward," she whispered. The kind of instruction used when there's something too complicated to explain out loud. Frank didn't blame them. He never did. But the feeling settling over his chest wasn't new. He had felt it before, though never quite like this. It was the sensation of being visible, yet unseen, present, but removed. Not a threat, not a hero, just something out of place. An echo in a space designed for carefully arranged noise. The security officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Everything okay over here?" he asked, mostly out of habit. Frank nodded once. "I'm fine. You can sit in general seating if you'd like. It's back through the main door's left side." "I'll stay right here," Frank replied. "I don't want to miss when he walks across." The officer gave a non-committal shrug and backed away. On stage, the names were being read now. Graduates began lining up behind the curtains. Their families leaned forward in anticipation, phones held high, ready to capture the moment their child stepped into the spotlight. Frank stayed where he was, eyes fixed on the center aisle. Behind him, someone spoke again. "It's just weird. Like, why is he even here if he doesn't belong to anybody?" "Probably wandered in," another voice answered. "I'm sure security's handling it." Frank exhaled quietly. He had carried men on his back through mortar fire. He had stood in front of children holding rifles, negotiating lives with nothing but his empty hands. He had been in places where the line between respect and survival was just a breath. And yet here in this bright, polished room among people wrapped in polite celebration, He was more unwelcome than he had ever felt in uniform. He didn't say a word. He didn't correct anyone. Because when you've been left behind enough times, you learn there's no use in chasing the front. But this time felt different, not because it hurt more, but because it revealed something deeper. He wasn't just being left out. He was being erased. Not angrily, not intentionally, just cleanly, neatly. The way society does when someone no longer fits the picture. Not for the first time, Frank wondered if showing up had been a mistake. But that thought died the moment he remembered Jason's handwriting. Front row, beside me. No amount of oversight could take that away. And yet the silence was beginning to close in. Not the quiet kind, but the heavy, pressurized one that builds just before a storm breaks. Frank felt it in the air, like the charge before lightning strikes. He had learned long ago to recognize moments that shift the tide not with noise, but with the tension of what's about to happen. He was standing in one of those now. And he wasn't alone. Because as he held his ground beside the emergency exit, unmoving, unblinking, dismissed as an oddity by most in the room, there were others watching. Not the staff, not the families, 6 men, seated in the 5th row. And while no one else saw Frank for who he was, they did. The night before the ceremony, the university parking lot was nearly empty, quiet, except for the occasional hum of a street lamp and the chirp of sprinklers ticking across trimmed lawns. Frank sat behind the wheel of his old Dodge pickup engine, off windows cracked. A thin blanket was wrapped around his shoulders. The cab smelled faintly of coffee and dust. He hadn't eaten since morning, but he wasn't hungry. Not really. His eyes were on the dashboard, where a folded piece of paper lay waiting. Earlier that week he had received it in the mail, a simple envelope with his son's handwriting slightly tilted to the left. Inside was a note written in blue ink. No ceremony schedule, no formal invite, just Jason's words, raw and deliberate. "Dad, I want you in the front row, because I'm proud of you." Frank had read that line at least 50 times. He kept it folded in the breast pocket of his Marine Corps jacket, right where medals used to hang. But tonight, he unfolded it again. The edges were soft, starting to tear where his thumb had pressed too many times. He adjusted in the driver's seat, careful not to let the interior light switch on. His back ached from the long drive, 3 states, 9 hours straight. He could have stopped, but there wasn't money for a motel. Not after paying for the gas to get here. Not after fixing the rear axle last week just to make sure the truck would survive the trip. Pride would have been a cheap excuse to avoid asking Jason for help, but it wasn't pride. It was something else. A man should carry his weight. That's what Frank believed. That's what he'd taught Jason. Just before midnight, a flashlight beam cut across the window. Someone knocked on the glass, sharp. Frank blinked, then lowered the window halfway. "Evening, sir," a campus police officer said, stepping back just enough to keep one hand near his holster. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" "Waiting for morning," Frank replied. "You staying on campus?" "No, just here for the graduation. You got ID on you." Frank reached into his coat and handed over his license. The officer took it, ran the name over his radio. Frank could hear the static reply. Nothing flagged, no warrants, no threats, just another old man and an old truck in the wrong place after dark. "Sir, this lot isn't designated for overnight parking," the officer said, though his tone softened a notch. "You planning to be here long?" Frank nodded toward the building in the distance. "My son is graduating tomorrow morning. I'll be gone by noon." The officer paused. His flashlight beam dipped slightly, hitting the edge of the letter on the dashboard. He didn't ask about it. "I'll let it go tonight," he said, handing back the ID. "Just don't leave the truck running or draw attention." "Wasn't planning to," Frank replied. The officer stepped away. No goodbyes, no offers, just footsteps fading into the night. Frank rolled up the window again and exhaled. The moment passed like so many others. He had never been one to expect warmth from strangers. He reached for the letter once more, smoothed it out on his thigh, and read it again in the silence. "Dad, I want you in the front row, because I'm proud of you." That line landed heavier than any citation, any injury, any forgotten promotion. It wasn't about the seat. It was about being seen. Not by a crowd, not by a program, just by the one person whose opinion mattered more than the medals on his jacket or the years he'd left behind on foreign soil. Frank had buried men who never came home. He'd stood in formation beside families, holding folded flags, unable to say anything useful. He had carried guilt, the kind that doesn't heal with time or logic. You don't forget who you couldn't save. But for Jason, for this one moment, he could keep a promise. He could show up. He didn't sleep much that night. He didn't need to. At 4:50 a.m., he started the engine, moved the truck to a spot near the rear entrance of the auditorium, and used a paper towel to wipe down his jacket. No medals, no ribbons, just the fabric and the memory of what it once meant. He didn't wear the jacket to impress anyone. He wore it because it was the best thing he owned. He didn't want Jason to see him in old flannel or grease-stained shirts. He wanted to look clean, present, solid. By 7:00 a.m., the lot began to fill. Students and parents arrived in waves. Frank waited in the truck until the crowd was thick enough to blend into. Then he stepped out, closed the door softly behind him, and walked toward the entrance with the folded letter pressed firmly against his chest. He wasn't asking for recognition. He wasn't chasing applause. He just wanted to keep a promise. The kind made between a father and son that doesn't get written in programs or called over microphones. And yet when the moment arrived, when he finally reached the gate and named his son, they turned him away, like he was a stranger trying to crash the celebration. All he had asked for was a seat, and even that had been denied. The auditorium dimmed as the master of ceremonies welcomed everyone to the 87th commencement of Marshall University. Stage lights flooded the podium, casting a golden hue across the stage curtains, now trembling from the sudden blast of cold air from overhead vents. Hundreds of heads turned forward. Phones were raised. Applause rolled through the air in polite, practiced waves. Frank remained standing at the side of the hall just past the emergency exit, a few feet from where the VIP section ended. No one had asked him to move again. No one had looked twice since security quietly withdrew. They'd already done their part, handled the issue, cleared the optics. As long as he stayed out of sight, out of frame, he was someone else's problem. The announcer introduced the dean's son, Ryan McMillan, who had been chosen to deliver the opening remarks. As the young man stepped up to the microphone, a murmur of anticipation moved through the audience. Ryan's father, Dean Charles McMillan, sat proudly in the front row, straightening his tie as cameras swung toward the stage. Ryan adjusted the mic with a confident flick. His robe crisped the gold cords around his neck, shimmering under the lights. "Good morning," Ryan began, smiling wide. "It is a great honor to speak today, not just as a student, but as the son of this great institution's leader. My father's values, discipline, class, and tradition are what made this place exceptional for me and so many others." Applause, again this time, more sustained. A woman near the front row dabbed her eye. Frank didn't move. Ryan continued, his voice sharp and theatrical. "Today we recognize not only achievement but the families who stood behind us, those who shaped us, supported us, and represent the values we hold dear." He paused here intentionally. I speak, of course, of the families who reflect the kind of legacy we can be proud to display, the ones who know how to represent themselves, and this university. Laughter, subtle at first, then spreading. Frank heard it. Not the volume, but the intent. He'd been in enough high-level debriefs to know how coded language worked. He'd heard officers cloak judgment in protocol, senators insult soldiers without ever raising their voices. The joke was indirect, but its aim wasn't vague. It was fired with precision. In the fifth row, a man in a dark civilian suit, short-cropped hair, hands folded, shifted his posture. Another man beside him leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Their eyes found Frank at once. Still by the wall. Still standing. Frank's expression didn't change. Ryan wasn't finished. "My classmates," he said, adopting a lighter tone, "have endured a lot these past 4 years. Essays, internships, job interviews, and even dining hall food." More laughter, and yet we've risen. With the help of those who've walked the right paths, carried themselves with dignity, and let's be honest, worn jackets that still fit. This time the laughter hit harder. A few heads turned toward the side aisle toward Frank. He didn't react. Not even a blink. But inside, the air shifted. He'd worn this same Marine dress jacket through his final deployment. He'd worn it to every memorial he'd attended since, folded it over his arm, while standing in line at the VA clinic, kept it pressed and packed in a cedar trunk for 20 years. It was the only formal thing he owned. He wore it today because his son had asked him to be present. And presence in Frank's world had always meant showing up dressed with intention. He didn't need applause, but he hadn't expected mockery. He wasn't alone in his reaction. In the fifth row, 6 men shared a glance. They weren't seated together by accident. They had bought tickets separately, arrived without fanfare, dressed to blend in. Most of them hadn't worn a uniform in years, but their posture gave them away. The kind you don't lose because you never unlearn how to sit like you're still in a briefing room. 3 of them had scars that would never show in photographs. 1 had an artificial hand. They weren't friends in the usual sense, but they had bled near each other. That was enough. The tallest of the 6, a man named Nick Wallace, let his eyes settle on Frank. "Is that him?" one of the others whispered. Nick gave the faintest nod. "Yeah, he looks thinner. Yeah, but that's him." In his coat pocket, Nick reached for his phone, not to text, but to pull up a file. Not digital, physical. A laminated photo card he kept behind his ID. It showed a group of men in desert fatigues, 6 kneeling, 1 standing. Dust blowing hard enough to blur the flag in the background. The man standing was Frank Harris, a decade younger, same jawline, same eyes. That photo was taken 20 minutes after Frank dragged Nick bleeding from the side out of a compound south of Fallujah. No air cover, no extraction, just smoke yelling and Frank yelling louder. He hadn't waited for orders, he had moved. And they had followed. Now, watching Frank from across the room, it felt surreal. They had thought they'd never see him again. When one of them learned that Jason Harris was graduating at Marshall and that his father might attend, they bought tickets without asking questions. If Frank showed up, they'd be there. Nick slipped the card back into his coat, his face unreadable. Then he straightened in his chair. They'd all heard the joke. They all knew who it was aimed at. They had heard those kinds of jokes before from politicians, from bureaucrats, from civilians with soft hands and softer convictions. And every time they had bitten their tongues. But this time the target was Frank, and this time they weren't going to stay seated. They didn't speak, they didn't signal, but between them an agreement passed wordlessly. If he's touched, we move. If he's taken out, we stand. Not one of them looked at the stage again. Their eyes were on the man by the wall, the man in the faded jacket with no name badge, no credentials, no power. The man who had once carried them all and now stood alone. The moment Ryan McMillan stepped off the stage, applause erupted again, more out of obligation than enthusiasm. People rose slightly in their seats, adjusted themselves, murmured about how well-spoken the dean's son had been. On the side of the hall, Frank remained motionless, still framed in the hard white glow of a stage light that reached just far enough to catch the dust floating around him. He didn't try to hide. He didn't need to. He wasn't a threat. He was a shadow in a room that didn't want to acknowledge him. The security guard who approached this time wasn't a volunteer or a part-time student worker. His nameplate read, Ron, in thick block letters. Mid-40s, barrel-chested and clearly used to enforcing compliance with as few words as possible. He didn't come running. He didn't raise his voice. But the way he moved, controlled, direct, said everything. He stopped a few feet from Frank and squared his shoulders. "Sir," he said evenly, "we've had a few complaints." Frank turned his head just enough to show he was listening. "Some guests feel you're making them uncomfortable," Ron continued. "I've been asked to escort you outside while we confirm your name on the official guest list." "I'm not causing trouble," Frank said. His voice didn't waver. "I'm just waiting to see my son walk across that stage." Ron nodded but didn't retreat. "That's fine. I'm not here to accuse you of anything. We just need you to step outside for a moment. University policy." Frank looked past Ron toward the rows of chairs stretching out before him. He could almost imagine Jason among them. Almost. "My name is Frank Harris," he said. "Jason Harris is my son. He invited me." "I hear you," Ron said, keeping his tone calm. "But you're not on the wristband list. and someone flagged your presence earlier, so for now we need you to come with me." Behind Ron, a woman sitting on the aisle leaned toward her husband and whispered too loudly to go unnoticed. Finally, "He's been standing there for over an hour. Honestly, it's getting uncomfortable." Her husband nodded. "He doesn't look stable," another voice added from the row behind them. "Just move him quietly before someone posts about it." Frank heard all of it. Still, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply adjusted the folded letter in his coat pocket and took a half step forward. "If it helps you do your job," he said, "I'll walk with you." "But I'm not leaving this building." Ron seemed to consider this. He reached for the radio on his shoulder but stopped short. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." "I'm not here to make anything hard," Frank replied. "I just want to see my son graduate." The simplicity of that line hung in the air like a slow exhale, something so profoundly human that even Ron paused before answering. A woman a few seats down shook her head. "I don't know why he's making this a scene." Frank turned just slightly toward her. "This isn't a scene," he said, still steady. "This is what quiet looks like when no one listens." Ron finally gestured toward the side door. "Please, sir, just for a moment." Frank looked at the door, then back toward the crowd, toward the stage. His son was somewhere behind the curtain waiting for his name to be called, rehearsing his steps, fixing his gown. Jason didn't know that his father, the one who had answered every Sunday call, who had driven 3 states and slept in a truck just to be here, was being quietly removed. Frank lowered his head slightly, clenched his jaw once, and nodded. "All right," he said. "Lead the way." They began moving down the aisle. And then it happened. A sound broke the pattern of shifting programs and muffled conversations. Subtle at first. A chair, wooden legs scraping against tile, then another, and another, from the 5th row. 6 chairs moved, not from accident or restlessness, but in perfect sequence. 6 men stood up, deliberate, silent, synchronized like they'd done it before. They didn't say a word. They didn't wave hands. But their posture alone disrupted the rhythm of the room. People began to turn their heads, sensing something unnatural in the uniform stillness of these men who no longer wore uniforms. Frank paused mid-step. He knew that kind of silence. He'd felt it before, just before a perimeter is breached or when a mission changes without warning. That second between breath and reaction, when everything hangs on a thread. Ron noticed it too. He looked over his shoulder, saw the 6 standing, took a half step closer to Frank. "You know them?" he asked under his breath. Frank didn't answer. He didn't need to, because the message had already been sent. Not by words, but by presence. 6 men, standing in the middle of a seated crowd, not with aggression, but with allegiance. And they were not going to let him walk alone. The moment the 6 men rose, it wasn't loud. It wasn't meant to be. But the air inside the auditorium changed, as if someone had opened a door in a sealed room. Conversations cut short. Heads turned. Even the stage lights, previously blinding in their warmth, seemed to dim just slightly, focusing instead on the silent defiance spreading across the 5th row. They didn't look around. They didn't need validation or approval. Each of them had spent years in operations where hesitation meant death. Standing up in a college auditorium wasn't a rebellion, it was reflex. The tallest among them, Nick Wallace, took the first step forward. The others followed, creating a line between the stage and Frank, who had stopped moving halfway down the aisle. His back was still straight, his hands still at his sides, but something in his posture had softened, not in weakness but in recognition. He hadn't seen these men in over a decade. And yet in that instant, time folded. One of the guests in row 6, a college student with her phone already out, instinctively began recording. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew it was important. She captured the way the men advanced, each at their own pace, but somehow moving as one. No words, no gestures, just the sound of dress shoes and boots over polished floor. Nick reached into his jacket. From the inner pocket, he pulled something small and metallic, gold, triangular, unmistakable. A Navy SEAL trident. He held it in the air, not high like a trophy, but steady. A signal. A declaration. The second man did the same, then the third, until 6 badges were visible. Some were weathered, others new. But they all bore the same emblem anchor eagle pistol trident. The weight of silence grew unbearable. A woman 2 rows behind gasped. A man in a university polo shirt leaned forward, whispering to his wife, "Is this part of the ceremony?" But no one answered. Because this wasn't theater. This wasn't a tribute scheduled in the program. This was loyalty, raw, unfiltered, and undeniable. Frank looked at the badges, then at the men. He hadn't expected this. Not from them. Not here. The last time he'd seen most of these faces, they were covered in grit, and blood crouched behind overturned Humvees or dragging wounded comrades through broken doors. Back then there had been no fanfare, just survival. They owed him nothing. But here they were. Nick didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he finally spoke, his words cut through the noise like a scalpel. "That man doesn't leave the room," he said. Every head turned. Nick's eyes scanned the crowd, then settled on Ron, the security officer, who now stood completely still beside Frank. "He led us through hell," Nick continued. "He's staying right here." The room held its breath. Ron looked from Frank to the 6 men, then back to the crowd. People now frozen, cameras forgotten in hands, programs drooping. No one dared interrupt. Frank opened his mouth, but Nick shook his head once. "Not here. Not now. This wasn't about gratitude. It was about clarity. They weren't making a request. They were making a decision, and no one, no usher, no staff member, no dean's son with polished words was going to overrule them." The woman from earlier, the one who had whispered about Frank being a disruption, now sat rigid in her seat, her eyes darting between the badges and the face of the man she'd dismissed minutes ago. She clutched her handbag tighter, suddenly aware that the world she understood was no longer the room's center of gravity. The student recording continued filming, now holding her breath to keep the audio clean. Somewhere on the edge of the auditorium, another phone lifted. And another. Whatever was happening was no longer just being seen. It was being shared. The 6 SEALs remained in formation. They didn't approach Frank. They didn't need to flank him or circle around him. Their presence had already formed a wall. It was no longer about seating assignments, wristbands, or policy. It was about principle. And if anyone had dared to ask who gave them the authority to take over the moment, well, they would have pointed to Frank Harris. Because when a man saves your life, you stand when the world tries to erase him. There are gestures louder than protests. Standing is one of them. Raising a badge isn't just identification, it's allegiance. And in that moment, without rank or command, Frank Harris had been made visible again. Not because he asked, but because those who remembered stood up first. And then Nick looked back to the crowd, eyes locking with those still watching, still frozen, still not sure what this meant. And he said something else, something that would land heavier than any speech made that morning, something that would shatter the last wall of doubt in the room. And what he said next silenced even the stage. Nick Wallace looked out at the sea of stunned faces. He had just finished raising his SEAL trident, and 5 others had done the same beside him. No one in the auditorium dared speak. Not the staff, not the dean, not even the guests who had whispered earlier about moving that man quietly to the back. The 6 of them had stood in silence, and that silence now held the entire room hostage. Frank remained where he was by the aisle, half a step ahead of the security officer, who no longer seemed so sure of what to do. Light from the stage had drifted just enough to fall across his shoulders, as if the room itself was reluctantly remembering who he was. And then Nick took one more step forward, cleared his throat, and spoke not with ceremony but with fact. "He's the reason we're alive." The words didn't boom, they struck. A phone slipped from someone's hand in the audience. The sound of it hitting the floor rang out sharper than applause. Conversations halted mid-whisper. Heads turned so fast a few guests visibly flinched. Every eye snapped to the man who had just spoken, and then to Frank Harris. Nick didn't stop. His voice was calm, even as if reading from a file sealed long ago. Fallujah, 2006. Operation Phantom Sun. No air support. No backup. 6 of us trapped inside a building with a wall blown open and 2 men already hit. We radioed command. They told us to hold and pray. He nodded toward the other 5. This man didn't pray. He got in a truck and came anyway. Alone. The air in the room thinned. He wasn't even combat assigned. He was logistics. But he left the convoy behind, hiked the last 3 blocks on foot, and got us all out. Under fire, while dragging 2 of us one-armed. No cameras, no credit. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was crushing. Nick took another breath. He never asked for recognition. He told us, "Don't remember me. Remember to do the same when it's your turn. And now you want to move him outside because he doesn't have a wristband." Frank's eyes remained forward, unmoved, his expression unreadable. But the room felt him now. Not as an intruder, but as a fixed point. A presence that shifted the scale of everything. Whispers turned to gasps. Parents leaned into their children. A professor near the front put down her program, her hands shaking slightly. Someone else, the woman who had asked for Frank to be removed earlier, couldn't meet his eyes anymore. Her face flushed, not from embarrassment, but from something colder. Regret. Ron, the security officer, lowered the radio on his shoulder. He didn't need instructions anymore. Nick looked to him briefly. "You don't have to escort him anywhere," he said simply. "He's where he's supposed to be." And then from somewhere in the back, someone clapped. Just once. Then another. But it wasn't applause, not yet. It was disbelief turning into recognition. A man who had been invisible had just been unmasked as indispensable. Frank didn't speak. He didn't need to. The story had already been told. And now the question echoed unspoken through every corner of the hall. How close had they come to erasing someone who had once risked everything to protect people he didn't even know? The shift was visible. Guests who had kept their distance now leaned slightly forward. Students who had rolled their eyes at the solemn old man now sat with hands clasped and brows furrowed. Eyes that had judged his jacket now saw something else in its wear, something earned. Nick stepped back into formation with the other SEALs, their badges returned to their pockets, but their message still standing tall in the air. They had done their part. But what came next wouldn't be theirs to say. Because just behind the stage curtain, a voice, young, unsure, but burning with certainty, was waiting to step into the light. From behind the thick velvet curtain, Jason Harris had heard everything. The crowd's reaction. The silence. The story. He'd been standing in line with the rest of the graduates, the stiff collar of his gown biting at his neck cap, tilted slightly from the tension building in his jaw. One hand clenched the folded note card of his prepared speech, the other flexed tightly at his side. The program said he'd be walking the stage in 12 minutes. But none of that mattered now, because his father wasn't in the front row. He wasn't in any row. Jason leaned just far enough to peek past the curtain. His heart skipped when he saw him standing alone barely beyond the rope line, a security guard beside him, and 6 men in civilian suits surrounding him like an honor guard that had waited 10 years to report back to duty. Jason stepped out of line. The faculty member at the curtain tried to stop him. "You're up soon," she said, unsure whether to reach for his arm or just let him go. "I know," Jason replied. "But I've got something to say first." He walked out slowly, not toward the podium at center stage, but to the microphone positioned on the side where guest speakers had been introduced. The hall, still stunned from the SEAL's revelation, now fell completely still as the young man in graduation robes reached for the mic without permission. No one moved to stop him. Not after what had just happened. Jason adjusted the mic, cleared his throat, and looked out into the crowd, not at the stage, not at the dean, but toward the side aisle where his father stood. His voice, when it came, was steady, loud, and deeply personal. "That's my dad." Every head turned. "He's the one you were all just talking about. Frank Harris, you know. The man who almost got kicked out of this room because his jacket didn't match yours." A pause. No one interrupted. Jason continued stepping forward slowly as he spoke. He never asked for recognition. Never told anyone what he did. He just showed up every Sunday, every phone call, every time I wanted to quit, every moment I thought I wasn't going to make it through this place. He held up a letter, folded and worn. He mailed me this 3 years ago when I failed 2 classes and wanted to drop out. It said, "If you're gonna quit, quit tomorrow. But tonight, rest, eat, and remember who raised you." A murmur moved through the rows. Jason lowered the letter. "I'm here because of him. I'm proud to graduate today, but I'm more proud to be his son." He looked toward the front row where the dean sat still and pale. "And if he's not welcome here, then neither am I." The words landed like thunder. Without waiting for a cue, Jason removed his cap and gown in one swift motion and dropped them neatly on the edge of the stage. Beneath the robe, he wore a white shirt tucked into dark slacks, simple, clean, respectful. Then he did something no one expected. He stepped off the stage and marched straight down the steps. The room parted without instruction, students and faculty moving aside like water around a vessel. His shoes echoed on the floor. When he reached his father, he stood tall, shoulders squared, feet firm. Then he raised his hand in a crisp, practiced salute, straight to his father's face. The kind of salute taught in early mornings and tested under pressure. The kind that didn't just signify respect, it demanded it. Frank didn't salute back. He looked into his son's eyes for a long second, then took one step forward and pulled Jason into his arms. Tight, without a word. The audience didn't move. Then came the second wave. All 6 Navy SEALs in perfect sequence raised their right hands and offered the same salute, not to Frank now, but to the bond between the man and his son. No one gave them orders. No one told them to rise. They moved as one. Not as soldiers, as brothers. And just like that, the image was complete. A father in a faded jacket, a son in white, and 6 men standing behind them like a silent line of proof that honor doesn't expire with rank or age. There were no claps, no shouts, no speeches, only stillness, the kind of stillness that rewrites people's understanding. Because in that one moment, hundreds of people learned that respect isn't printed on invitations. It isn't granted by programs or pinned to seating charts. It's earned in silence. It's recognized in instinct. And sometimes it stands in the back of a room for hours without saying a word until the people it once protected remember how to see. And in that moment, as father and son stood side by side, the crowd realized they hadn't just misjudged a man. They had forgotten a lesson. And now, watching this man they had nearly removed from the room be saluted by war heroes and embraced by his son, they were forced to learn it again. Frank didn't rush. He never did. When Jason stepped aside, still standing at full attention, as if guarding something sacred, Frank moved forward with calm precision. His boots, worn but clean, struck the floor with soft, measured weight. The crowd didn't breathe. They parted for him the way soldiers clear a corridor when a fallen comrade is carried through, without instructions, without ceremony, just respect. He walked toward the front row, the place that had been off-limits an hour ago, the place he had been told more than once he didn't belong. Jason stayed close behind, not guiding, not shielding, just walking in formation, as he'd learned from his father's footsteps long before the university taught him anything else. As they reached the front, Amanda, the usher in the black blazer who had blocked Frank earlier, stepped back instinctively. Her clipboard was still in her hands, though her grip had loosened. She glanced up, and for the first time that day her eyes met his. Frank didn't glare. He didn't smirk. He didn't look away. He just looked. and Amanda blinked, her throat tightening as she stepped sideways, quietly clearing the way. No apology passed her lips. She knew better. Any words she might offer would only underline what had already been undone. Frank and Jason took the 2 empty seats at the end of the reserved row. The same ones Jason had asked for in his letter. The ones Frank had been denied for not having a wristband, not dressing, right, not looking like he belonged to the elite. But now no one stopped them. No one dared. The woman in pearls, the same one who had earlier commented that Frank didn't belong, sat exactly 3 chairs away, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She glanced at Frank, then looked down. Her face flushed with a quiet shade of shame that no lighting could hide. Beside her, her husband shifted uncomfortably, straightened his jacket, and pretended to read the program again. Frank didn't acknowledge them. He wasn't here for apologies. And besides, none would have been enough. Because some offenses aren't undone by words, they're undone by truth. And truth had already stood, saluted, and walked him to the front row. The weight of silence settled over that section like a blanket, heavy, pressurized. Every seat around him that once bristled with judgment now buzzed with quiet self-correction. People who had laughed now sat still. Those who had whispered now dared not speak. No one leaned away, but no one leaned in either. They weren't afraid of him. They were afraid of what they had become in his presence. The dean, seated a few rows over, watched all of this with a pale face and clenched jaw. His fingers drummed the edge of his program like a man trying to remember a script that no longer applied. The plan had been simple: polished speakers, polite applause, photogenic moments for the alumni newsletter. Instead, he now shared a room with 6 seals, standing like guardians, and a man who had once been ordered to leave now, sitting in the very seat meant to honor family. No one announced it, no one corrected the record, but the hierarchy had shifted. It wasn't the seats that changed, it was who filled them, and for a brief, stunning stretch of time, no one clapped, no one coughed, no one whispered, because silence when chosen is louder than condemnation. And in that silence, every guilty glance, every swallowed apology became its own confession. Jason sat with his hands on his lap, his breathing steady. He didn't look at his father. He didn't need to. They both knew what this moment was and what it had cost. Frank leaned back, exhaled once, and for the first time since the ceremony began, he allowed his muscles to relax. Not in surrender, but in completion. He had made it, not just into the room, but through it. What had started as a quiet attempt to witness his son's milestone had become a mirror held up to an entire room's assumptions. And now that room didn't look the same. It wasn't the flowers or the lighting or the flags on the stage. It was the people, their posture, their awareness, their reckoning. Frank didn't need a microphone. He didn't need a seat on stage or a ribbon across his chest. All he needed was this chair, this moment, beside his son. The rest they had given him in silence. And then from the edge of the room, beyond the rows, the badges and the weight of what had just happened, a new voice rose. It didn't belong to a soldier. It didn't belong to a student. It didn't carry rank or command. It belonged to a mother. When the ceremony ended, the applause wasn't immediate. It wasn't the kind that explodes after a keynote speech or a celebrity appearance. It was slower, deeper earned. One row started, then another. No one stood. They just clapped, measured and unsure at first, then, with something closer to reverence. Not for the program, not for the degrees, for what they had just witnessed. Then the music played, cueing the recessional. Students filed out in quiet rows, tassels swinging, smiles cautious, as if they too weren't sure how to behave anymore. What had begun as a routine graduation had shifted into something else entirely. And as the doors opened and families began to pour out into the corridors, a new kind of energy moved with them, one of reflection of eyes, meeting eyes they had once ignored. Frank and Jason remained seated. They hadn't spoken since sitting down. Jason glanced over once just to make sure his father hadn't disappeared. He hadn't. Frank sat like he always had in full presence, with nothing to prove and nowhere else to be. The crowd thinned. Voices returned softly at first. Parents called out to their children. Photos were taken, caps tossed, laughter resumed. But every person who passed the first row slowed just a bit. Some stopped. One man in a navy suit offered a quiet nod to Frank, then moved on. A woman in heels hesitated, whispered "thank you," and didn't wait for a response. It was as if they needed to say something but didn't trust themselves to say enough. Then a mother. Mid-50s, brown hair streaked with gray. She moved through the row of folding chairs, not hurried, not dramatic. She paused just behind Frank, her hand holding the wrist of her teenage daughter. She leaned in and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. He turned, slightly unsure whether to brace or deflect, but all she said was this: "Thank you for raising him right." Frank didn't reply. He didn't nod. He simply let the words rest where they landed. Some truths didn't require a response. They weren't compliments. They were acknowledgments. Jason heard it too. He blinked, caught off guard. She hadn't said "thank you for your service." She hadn't mentioned Fallujah. She hadn't called out the Trident badges or asked for photos. She had thanked him for the one thing that had brought Frank here, not what he'd done in war, but what he'd done in silence. At home. As a father. More students passed, some offering outstretched hands. One shook Frank's hand quickly and said, "You probably don't remember me, but Jason used to help me study in the library every Sunday. He said it was something you taught him. Be useful, even when it's hard. I thought you should know that helped me graduate." Frank didn't remember the kid's name, but he remembered the advice. He shook the hand, and the student moved on. Another stopped but didn't speak. She simply placed her palm over her heart, met Frank's eyes, and walked away. These weren't staged thank yous. They weren't for show. These were words and gestures from people who had learned something that morning, not about history, but about humility. And now the man who had been labeled a disruption, who had stood beside the fire exit like an afterthought, was being quietly redefined. He was no longer the man in the jacket. He was no longer that guy near the wall. He was Jason's dad. And somehow that title now carried more weight than any rank ever pinned to his chest. Jason stood, finally stretching the stiffness out of his back. "You ready?" he asked, his voice soft. Frank rose with him. "I've been ready." They began to move slowly toward the side exit, away from the crowds and cameras. Neither of them needed to linger. The message had already been delivered. Not by speech, not by recognition, by presence, by staying. But as they made their way through the narrow hall leading toward the rear parking lot, a familiar rhythm echoed behind them. Not footsteps, not applause, a formation, boots, moving in sync, not for war, for tribute. Frank stopped. Jason did too. The 6 men from row 5 were following their pace, deliberate, their spacing familiar. They didn't say anything. Not yet. Because they weren't finished. They hadn't come just to stand up. They had brought something with them, and they weren't leaving until it was placed in the right hands. The sun had moved higher by the time Frank and Jason stepped out into the open air. The sharp lines of the building behind them gave way to a quiet plaza, where graduates posed beside fountains and families reassembled for photos, their laughter now echoing in softened tones. The parking lot stretched in the distance, dotted with minivans and sedans decked out in class year decals and balloons. But Frank wasn't heading toward his truck. Not yet. Jason walked beside him, his robe slung over one shoulder cap in his hand. Neither of them had said much since leaving the auditorium. There wasn't a need. What needed to be spoken had already passed between them in silence, in the moment where Jason had saluted and Frank had embraced him. But footsteps behind them, 6 sets heavy and paced, called for one final moment. Frank turned. The SEALs had followed at a respectful distance, not close enough to crowd, not far enough to feel like strangers. When Frank stopped, they did too, and then Nick Wallace stepped forward, one hand reaching into the inside pocket of his coat. "I didn't know if you'd show up," Nick said, his voice quieter now, without the weight of a crowd around him. Frank didn't answer, just waited. Nick pulled out a small object and held it between his thumb and forefinger, a coin gold-edged embossed with an eagle and anchor on one side and a unit insignia on the other. It wasn't flashy. It didn't gleam. It looked like it had been carried for a long time. "You probably never got one of these," Nick said. "Most of the time they hand them out after speeches, or to the guys who take photo ops." He paused, then extended it. "But this one was carried into Mosul, Kandahar, Syria. And it was passed to me by a man who said, 'Only give it to the one who showed you the standard.'" Frank looked at the coin, but didn't take it right away. Nick nodded once firm. "You were the standard. You still are." Frank accepted the coin with both hands, not out of ceremony, but because he understood what it meant. Challenge coins weren't souvenirs. They weren't given lightly. They were a mark, a statement, an acknowledgement of someone who had gone beyond the call, someone who'd held the line when it would have been easier to let it break. He turned it slowly in his palm, feeling its weight settle into his skin. Nick didn't explain further. He didn't need to. Frank closed his fingers around it, and for the first time that day his shoulders eased, not dropped in exhaustion but relaxed in quiet acceptance. Then he looked over at Jason and smiled. It wasn't wide. It wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself, but Jason saw it. And in that moment the significance of everything became clear, not the battle stories, not the medals, not the standing ovation that never came. It was that his father, who had spent his life carrying the weight of others, had finally been handed something back. Not praise, not apology, just recognition. Jason stepped closer, his voice low. "You okay?" Frank nodded. "Yeah." Then after a pause, "That coin, that means something," Jason chuckled. "Yeah, it does." They stood in the plaza a moment longer, letting the spring air move around them. The SEALs had stepped back, now giving them space. No one else approached, no camera flashes, no press, just a father, his son, and a coin that carried more meaning than a room full of applause. Sometimes legacy isn't written in speeches or carved into buildings. Sometimes it's passed palm to palm in silence. And in Frank's silence, Jason finally saw the thing no uniform had ever explained. Dignity wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It stood its ground. And then it smiled. The chairs were being folded now, the stage lights dimmed one by one, programs lay abandoned beneath seats. Balloons bounced softly against the high ceilings, anchored by ribbons tied to backs of chairs that just hours earlier had been reserved for honor. The crowd had thinned to a whisper. Families had migrated to the parking lot. Graduates had disappeared into cars or restaurants, and the energy that once filled the auditorium had receded into something quieter, more reflective. But if you stood at the back of the room long enough, you could still feel it. The echo of a moment. The presence of a man who had once been asked to leave. He wasn't there anymore. Frank Harris had walked out 20 minutes ago, coin in hand, son beside him. No cameras followed him. No microphone waited outside. But in the space where he had once stood, just beside the fire, exit hands folded behind his back, a new kind of respect lingered. Not the ceremonial kind, not the one polished and planned and paraded for applause, the quiet kind, the earned kind. Somewhere in the upper section of the auditorium, a student still sitting cross-legged in the balcony uploaded a 30-second clip to TikTok. It started with the shot of 6 men standing from the 5th row, zoomed in on the Navy SEAL badges in their palms, then panned across the aisle to Frank, silent, unmoved, dignified. The caption she added was simple. He didn't need the spotlight. He just needed to be seen. The video began to spread. It wasn't flashy. There was no soundtrack. But people paused when they saw it. They watched to the end, because they recognized something in that stillness that their feeds rarely showed: truth. The kind that doesn't advertise itself. The kind you have to stop scrolling to feel. The voice of the narrator came in then, as if from somewhere not inside the room, but above it, watching what had unfolded, pulling meaning from the silence left behind. Next time you see someone standing alone at the back of the room, don't assume you know their story. Don't assume their silence is absence. Don't assume their clothes or their age or their distance makes them less important than the ones in the spotlight. A pause. A beat. Because some of them have already fought for everything you're celebrating. The camera lingered on the empty seat. Frank had finally taken the one marked family that no one had dared to question again after he sat down. Frank Harris didn't come today to be noticed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand a seat. He just showed up. A flashback montage ran silently, Frank standing still near the fire exit. Frank refusing to argue with the usher. Frank looking forward as Ryan McMillan laughed into the mic. Frank saying only, "I'm just waiting to see my son graduate." And when the room tried to forget him, others stood up to remind us why he mattered. Now the screen faded to black, save for one quote in white: "Respect isn't given to the loudest. It's owed to the quietest ones we never thought to thank." One last voiceover. Some heroes don't wear medals. They carry the silence that others can't. And sometimes all they need is a chance to be seen. The image faded back in Frank and Jason walking through the parking lot. No stage, no crowd, just the two of them. A father and son. The camera didn't follow. It stayed where he had stood, watching him leave, the same way the country had once watched him arrive with too little recognition and far too late. But not today. Today, someone had stayed long enough to see him. Some stories don't need sequels, just silence to settle in. Frank Harris didn't walk into that auditorium expecting to change anyone's mind. But sometimes all it takes is one man standing in the back of the room to remind us who really built the front row. This wasn't about a graduation. It was about recognition earned, not handed. About dignity that doesn't need applause to exist. And about the kind of love between a father and son that doesn't wait for permission. Now it's your turn. Have you ever met someone like Frank, quiet, overlooked, but unforgettable? Once you truly saw them, share their name, their story, or just what this moment meant to you in the comments below. And if you believe stories like Frank's deserve to be remembered, do us one favor, like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Because the world may forget headlines, but it remembers truth. Let's make sure it reaches the next person who needs to hear it.